what the elders never spoke aloud. Every empire is built on truths that are repeated and truths that are carefully avoided, stories told openly and lessons passed down only in silence. This story begins with one of those unspoken truths, hidden not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient to confront. To understand why this matters today, we must recognize how power educates its successors. Official lessons teach strategy, discipline, and history. Unofficial lessons teach restraint, obedience, and survival. But the most influential lessons are often the ones never articulated. The warnings implied, the doubts withheld, the realities masked by tradition. He sensed this absence early. As a young leader in training, he attended councils where elders spoke eloquently about legacy and unity. Yet when difficult questions arose about failure, regret, or unintended consequences, the room grew careful. Conversations redirected. Wisdom softened into abstraction. It was clear that certain topics were not forbidden, but discouraged. The first realization came during a private discussion following a national setback. Publicly, the event was framed as a temporary obstacle. Privately, he asked an elder what lessons had been learned. The response was polite, measured, and incomplete. It avoided responsibility without denying it. And in that moment, he understood that silence was being used not to protect truth, but to preserve comfort. As years passed, he noticed the pattern repeat. Mistakes were acknowledged only in vague terms. Successes were celebrated without examining their cost. The elders spoke often of stability, but rarely of the sacrifices that had shaped it. History, he realized, had been curated. The unspoken truth was this: the empire had survived not because every decision was right, but because its leaders learned quietly from the ones that were wrong. And no one had ever said that aloud. That silence began to trouble him, not as an accusation, but as a responsibility. If the next generation inherited only polished narratives, they would repeat mistakes already paid for in silence. Leadership, he believed, required more than reverence for the past. It required honesty about it. But to surface what the elders never spoke aloud meant confronting a tradition built on selective memory. And the moment he chose to ask the forbidden questions, the silence that had protected the empire for decades began to feel far more fragile than the truth it concealed. He began carefully, knowing that truth introduced without patience could sound like accusation. Instead of challenging the elders directly, he asked for stories, not the official versions, but the moments between them. He invited retired advisors, former ministers, and long-silent witnesses into private conversations, asking what decisions had cost the most and why those costs were rarely discussed. At first, the responses were guarded. Habit had trained them to smooth rough edges, to frame hardship as inevitability. But slowly, something shifted. One by one, they began sharing what history books never captured. A project rushed to preserve pride. A compromise accepted to avoid unrest. A decision made too late because no one wanted to be the first to admit uncertainty. These were not confessions of failure. They were acknowledgments of humanity. He noticed a pattern emerge. Many of the empire's greatest strengths have been born from mistakes. Mistakes that forced adaptation, humility, and restraint. Yet those same moments have been erased from public memory, replaced by narratives of flawless foresight. The elders had believed they were protecting legitimacy. In reality, they had hidden the very lessons that made survival possible. The conflict surfaced when he proposed documenting these untold moments, not as criticism, but as instruction. A living archive of decisions, missteps included, intended to guide future leaders with honesty rather than myth. The suggestion unsettled the council immediately. Some elders feared it would weaken authority. Others worried it would invite judgment. A few argued that the people did not need to know how fragile stability once was. He listened, then asked a single question. If leadership is built on learning, how can we expect wisdom to endure when its origins are concealed? The room fell into a familiar silence. But this time, it felt different. It was not avoidance. It was recognition. Resistance hardened briefly. One elder warned that exposing past doubt could undermine present confidence. Another insisted that reverence required distance. But beneath their objections, he sensed something else. A quiet relief at being invited to speak truths long carried alone. The The turning point came when a respected elder admitted that the silence had been heavy, that many had carried regret not because they made difficult choices, but because they were never allowed to explain them, that history, stripped of struggle, had become a burden instead of a guide. In that admission, the conflict shifted. The question was no longer whether truth should be spoken. It was whether the empire was strong enough to hear it. And as the elders exchanged glances shaped by decades of shared silence, he knew the next step would redefine how leadership was taught, by replacing myth with memory and reverence with understanding. The debate that followed was unlike any the council had faced before. There were no clear sides, no simple division between tradition and reform. Instead, the room was split between those who feared exposure and those who feared repetition. Silence, once their shared refuge, now felt like a risk. Some elders argued that revealing past doubts would invite scrutiny in a world eager to judge. They spoke of fragile trust, of narratives easily weaponized. Others countered that trust built on omission was already fragile. It simply had not been tested yet. The tension was not hostile, but deeply personal. Each voice carried decades of memory. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to reframe the conflict. This was not about confession, he said. It was about inheritance. Future leaders would either inherit wisdom with context or myths without instruction. And myths, he warned, collapse the moment reality diverges from expectation. The proposal evolved. Instead of public exposure, the archive would begin internally, a protected record accessible only to those preparing for leadership. Decisions documented with intent, doubt, consequence, and outcome, not to assign blame, but to preserve clarity, a place where uncertainty could be studied instead of hidden. That distinction mattered. Resistance softened. Elders who had remained silent leaned forward. One admitted that the hardest moments of his career were the ones no one ever discussed. Another confessed that repeating confident narratives had left him feeling dishonest with his own successors. Slowly, the room shifted from defense to reflection. The true turning point came when the eldest among them spoke again. She reminded them that tradition itself was once an innovation, a response to chaos shaped by people who acted without precedent. They had honored that history by freezing it, she said, but perhaps it was time to honor it by remembering it fully. Agreement did not arrive as consensus. It arrived as consent. They would begin the archive, not as a record of failure, but as a map of decisions made under pressure, a guide for those who would one day face similar uncertainty without the comfort of illusion. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere felt lighter, not resolved, but aligned. Silence had not been broken recklessly. It had been replaced with purpose. Yet he knew the final challenge remained. Because creating space for truth within leadership would change not only how the future was taught, but how the past would finally be understood. The archive began quietly, without announcement or ceremony. Elders recorded their accounts in private sessions, speaking not as guardians of image, but as witnesses of reality. Decisions were revisited with context restored. Doubts were named, consequences acknowledged. What emerged was not a story of weakness, but of resilience forged through uncertainty. The climax came when the first group of future leaders was granted access. They entered expecting strategy and precedent. Instead, they encountered humanity. Pages filled not with perfection, but with moments of hesitation, fear, and courage under pressure. They learned where judgment faltered, where timing failed, where silence had helped, and where it had harmed. And in that honesty, something remarkable happened. They felt prepared, not because the past offered answers, but because it revealed how answers were found. The elders watched this shift with quiet astonishment. Authority did not erode. Respect deepened. Reverence evolved. The leaders in training did not lose faith in the institution. They gained trust in it, trust that truth had been chosen over performance. The resolution unfolded over time. Conversations within the palace changed tone. Questions were no longer signs of weakness. Reflection became expected, not avoided. The culture of leadership adjusted slowly but decisively toward one grounded in memory rather than myth. One evening, alone with the growing archive, he reflected on what had truly changed. The elders had not lost dignity by speaking what they once withheld. They had reclaimed it, and the silence that once protected the empire had transformed into wisdom that could finally guide it. He understood then that the most dangerous legacy is not failure. It is unexamined success. By giving voice to what the elders never spoke aloud, he had ensured that the future would inherit not just power, but understanding. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? What the